Welcome to 1% Club YouTube channel. We are explaining book summaries to add value in your life and save your valuable time of your precious life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to our channel for long book summaries with complete information from the book. The first chapter of the first night is titled The Unknown Third Giant, and it serves as a bridge between the initial introduction and the deeper dive into the specifics of Alfred Adler's philosophy. The philosopher explains to the youth that while Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are household names in the world of psychology, their contemporary Alfred Adler developed a system that is arguably more practical and life-changing for the average person. He describes how Adler was one of the original members of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, but eventually broke away because he disagreed with Freud's obsession with the past and biological drives. The philosopher notes that while Freud viewed humans as being driven by their histories, Adler viewed humans as being drawn toward their goals. This distinction is vital because it moves the focus from what happened to you in the past to what you intend to do in the future, which provides a sense of agency and power to the individual. The dialogue becomes more intense as the youth tries to argue that some things simply cannot be changed, such as personality traits or physical limitations. The philosopher counters by stating that what we call personality is actually a lifestyle which is a set of chosen tendencies that we use to interact with the world. He explains that a person's lifestyle is not something they are born with, but something they start choosing around the age of 10 and continue to reinforce every day. This means that if a person is unhappy with their lifestyle, they have the ability to discard it and choose a new one at any moment. The youth finds this idea offensive because it implies that he is responsible for his own misery, and he accuses the philosopher of being heartless and ignoring the genuine suffering of people who have faced trauma. The second chapter, titled Why People Can Change, takes this argument further by exploring the concept of subjective interpretation in more detail. The philosopher asks the youth to consider why two people can have the same experience, yet one becomes a bitter recluse while the other becomes a resilient leader. He argues that it is not the experience itself that matters, but the meaning that the individual assigns to it. This is where the philosopher introduces the concept of the goal of the behavior, and he uses a striking example of a young man who stays in his room all day and refuses to go out into society. From a Freudian perspective, this would be seen as a result of past trauma or poor parenting, but the philosopher suggests that the young man is actually staying in his room to achieve a goal, such as gaining his parents' attention or avoiding the fear of failure in the outside world. The youth is stunned by this accusation and argues that no one would ever choose to be miserable or lonely. The philosopher remains calm and explains that people often choose to be unhappy because it serves a purpose, and it is often easier to stay in a known state of suffering than to face the uncertainty of change. He describes the fear of the unknown as a powerful force that keeps people trapped in their current lifestyles. To change one's life requires a tremendous amount of courage because it means giving up the excuses that have defined your identity for years. The philosopher tells the youth that his unhappiness is not a curse or a mistake of fate, but a tool he is using to protect himself from the risks of living. This chapter concludes with a challenge to the youth to stop looking at his life through the rearview mirror and to start looking at the choices he is making in the present moment. Chapter 3 is titled Trauma Does Not Exist, and it represents one of the most controversial and fundamental shifts in thinking within Adlerian psychology. The philosopher challenges the youth by stating that no experience is in itself a cause of our success or failure, because we are not determined by our experiences, but by the meaning we give them. He argues that by living in a state of etiology, which is the study of causation, we become like puppets of our past, unable to move forward because we believe we are broken by what has happened to us. Instead, he proposes teleology, which looks at the purpose behind our current state. He explains that we often treat our past experiences as a form of equipment, and we choose how to use that equipment to meet our current goals. If a person stays in their room because of a past trauma, the philosopher suggests they are actually using that past event as a tool to achieve the goal of staying safe or avoiding the judgment of others. The youth reacts with intense anger, accusing the philosopher of being cold and ignoring the very real suffering of those who have faced immense hardship. However, the philosopher remains firm, explaining that as long as we believe the past determines the present, we are denying our own capacity for change. He clarifies that while a traumatic event is certainly a difficult thing to endure, the outcome of that event is not set in stone. One person might use a difficult childhood as a motivation to become a success, while another uses it as a reason for their failure. The difference lies not in the past event itself, but in the subjective meaning the individual assigns to it in the here and now. This chapter forces the youth to consider that his own feelings of being a victim might actually be a lifestyle he has chosen to avoid the challenges of life. Chapter 4 is titled, People Fabricate Anger, and it takes the concept of teleology and applies it to our immediate emotional outbursts. To illustrate this, the philosopher tells a story of a person who gets into an argument with a waiter who has spilled coffee on them. Most people would say they got angry because the waiter made a mistake, but the philosopher argues that the person chose to become angry so they could use the emotion as a tool to shout and dominate the waiter. He suggests that the anger was a means to an end, which was to make the waiter submit and apologize. He even points out that if a person were in the middle of a screaming match and suddenly received a call from their boss, they would likely switch to a calm and professional tone instantly, which proves that anger is not an uncontrollable force, but a tool we pick up and put down as needed. The philosopher explains that emotions are often used as a way to avoid the hard work of communication and logic. It is much faster and easier to use anger to get what you want than it is to use reason. This leads to the broader Adlerian view that we are not at the mercy of our passions or our biological drives. We are the masters of our emotions, and we use them to achieve our social goals. The youth finds this idea deeply unsettling because it suggests that his own temper and his own sadness are not things that happen to him, but things he is creating for a purpose. By the end of this chapter, the philosopher has effectively stripped away the youth's excuses by showing him that his internal world is a product of his own will, and that he has the power to stop fabricating the emotions that keep him trapped in his current lifestyle. Chapter 5 is titled How to Live Without Being Controlled by the Past, and it serves as a definitive turning point where the philosopher begins to build a new framework for the youth to follow. He explains that if we allow ourselves to be defined by our previous experiences, we are essentially choosing to live in a state of spiritual death, where growth is impossible. The philosopher argues that the only way to truly live is to acknowledge that the past has no objective power over the present, unless we grant it that power through our own subjective interpretations. He describes the process of living in the here and now as a continuous act of creation, where every moment is an opportunity to redefine who we are and what we stand for. This requires a radical acceptance of personal responsibility because it means we can no longer blame our parents, our environment, or our history for our current state of mind. The dialogue explores the idea that most people are actually afraid of the freedom that comes with letting go of the past. If you are not a victim of your history, then you have no excuse for your current failures, and that realization can be terrifying. The philosopher suggests that people cling to their past identities because it gives them a predictable narrative to follow, even if that narrative is one of suffering. To live without being controlled by the past, One must have the courage to treat every day as a clean slate and to focus entirely on the goals and tasks that are right in front of them. This is the essence of Adlerian happiness, which is the freedom to move forward unburdened by the weight of things that cannot be changed. Chapter 6 is titled Socrates and Adler, and it places the current conversation within the broader context of Western philosophical tradition. The philosopher explains that his method of teaching, through dialogue and questioning, is a direct reflection of the Socratic method, which seeks to peel away layers of false belief until only the truth remains. He draws a parallel between Socrates, who believed that no one does wrong willingly, but only out of ignorance, and Adler, who believed that no one chooses a lifestyle they believe to be bad for them. Just as Socrates sought to awaken the minds of the citizens of Athens, the philosopher is trying to awaken the youth to the fact that his current lifestyle is a choice based on a misunderstood sense of self-preservation. The narrative emphasizes that Adlerian psychology is not just a medical or scientific theory, but a way of life that requires active participation and constant self-examination. The philosopher notes that while modern society often seeks quick fixes or biological explanations for human behavior, the teachings of Socrates and Adler require a much deeper and more difficult engagement with one's own soul. He argues that true wisdom is the recognition of one's own capacity for change and the willingness to pursue the truth even when it is uncomfortable. By the end of this chapter, the youth begins to see that his debate with the philosopher is not just an academic exercise, but a life-altering confrontation with his own reality. He realizes that, like the students of Socrates, he is being forced to question everything he once thought was true about his own character and the world around him. Chapter 7 is titled, Are You Okay, Just As You Are? And it addresses the fundamental conflict between self-acceptance and the desire for improvement. The philosopher explains that many people struggle with the idea of being okay exactly as they are because they confuse self-acceptance with resignation. He clarifies that accepting oneself does not mean being satisfied with every flaw or giving up on growth, but rather having the courage to acknowledge one's current state without judgment or fabrication. The youth argues that if he were truly okay as he is, he would have no motivation to change his life or escape his current misery. The philosopher counters this by explaining that true change can only begin from a place of honesty. If you are constantly loathing yourself or pretending to be someone else, you are using your energy to maintain a facade rather than to actually move forward. The dialogue explores the difference between being and doing. The philosopher suggests that a person's value is not tied to their achievements or their social status, but to their simple existence as a human being. This is a radical concept for the youth who believes that he must prove his worth through constant competition and external validation. The philosopher explains that the feeling of not being okay is often a result of comparing oneself to an idealized version of who they think they should be. By dropping these impossible standards and accepting the reality of the present moment, a person can find the peace necessary to make deliberate and healthy choices for their future. This chapter challenges the youth to consider that his self-hatred is not a sign of high standards, but a defensive mechanism that prevents him from ever having to take a real step toward his goals. Chapter 8 is titled Unhappiness is Something You Choose for Yourself, and it reinforces the Adlerian principle that our emotional states are not forced upon us by external circumstances. The philosopher reiterates that at some level we find a certain benefit in our own unhappiness. He explains that being unhappy can be a way to avoid responsibility to gain sympathy from others, or to have an excuse for why we are not living up to our potential. The youth is offended by this suggestion, arguing that no one would ever choose the pain and loneliness that he feels every day. The philosopher remains patient, and explains that the choice is often unconscious, but it is a choice nonetheless. He describes it as a lifestyle that has become so familiar that the individual is terrified of the effort required to build a new one. The narrative goes into detail about the concept of the life lie, which is the tendency to blame others or our environment for our lack of success. The philosopher argues that as long as the youth says, "I am unhappy because of my past," or "I am unhappy because of society," he is giving away his power to change. By admitting that he is choosing his unhappiness, he is also forced to admit that he has the power to choose something else. This realization is incredibly heavy because it removes the comfort of being a victim. The philosopher tells a story of a man who constantly complains about his job, but never applies for a new one, because the complaint itself provides him with a sense of identity and a way to bond with other unhappy people. The chapter concludes with the sobering thought that happiness requires the courage to be proactive and to stop using one's own suffering as a shield against the demands of the world. Chapter 9 is titled, "People Always Choose Not to Change," and it addresses the paradox of why individuals who claim to be miserable often stay exactly where they are. The philosopher explains that even if a person finds their current lifestyle to be unpleasant, it is still a known quantity that they have mastered over many years. Change, on the other hand, represents the unknown and the potential for new types of pain or failure that the person does not yet know how to handle. He argues that people are essentially making a constant and active decision to remain as they are because the misery they know feels safer than the happiness they do not. This chapter highlights that the real reason people do not change is not because they lack the ability, but because they lack the courage to face the anxiety that comes with a new way of living. The youth is challenged to see that his complaints about his personality or his environment are actually a way of avoiding the terrifying responsibility of choosing a different path. The dialogue further explores how people use their circumstances as a convenient excuse to stay stagnant. The philosopher points out that as long as a person says, "I cannot change because of my past," or "I cannot change because of my personality," they are effectively closing door on their own potential. This mental block serves as a protective layer that keeps their ego safe from the risk of actually trying and failing. He asserts that the moment a person decides to stop using these excuses, they are suddenly faced with the reality that their life is in their own hands. This realization is often so overwhelming that most people quickly retreat back into their old habits and justifications. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that change is not a matter of time or external support, but a matter of a single resolute decision to discard the old lifestyle, regardless of how comfortable it has become. Chapter 10 is titled, "Your Life is Decided Here and Now," and it brings the focus of the conversation back to the absolute power of the present moment. The philosopher argues against the idea of a linear timeline where the past dictates the future, and instead proposes that life is a series of dots or moments that exist independently. He explains that since the past no longer exists and the future has not yet arrived, the only reality that matters is what you are doing and thinking right now. By shifting the focus to the here and now, the philosopher strips away the power of trauma and the weight of long-term expectations. He tells the youth that no matter what has happened in his life up until this very second, he has the absolute freedom to decide who he will be in the next second. This radical focus on the present is the key to breaking free from the chains of etiology and the deterministic view of human nature. The philosopher uses the analogy of a traveler on a journey who focuses only on the step they are currently taking rather than the distant destination. He suggests that if you live each moment with intensity and purpose, your life becomes a complete and meaningful work at any given point. This removes the pressure of needing to achieve a grand goal in the future to justify your existence. The youth finds this concept both liberating and frightening, because it means there is no more waiting for the right time to start living. The philosopher insists that the right time is always right now, and that the decision to be happy or to be a person of value is one that must be made and remade in every single moment of one's life. The chapter ends with the powerful assertion that your life is not a story that has already been written, but a blank canvas that you are painting with every breath you take. Chapter 11 is titled Why You Dislike Yourself, and it delves into the painful reality of self-loathing and the hidden motives behind it. The philosopher observes that the youth is constantly pointing out his own flaws and claiming to be a person of no value. Instead of offering comfort, the philosopher suggests that the youth is actually focusing on his weaknesses for a specific reason, which is to avoid getting hurt in relationships with others. He argues that by disliking yourself and highlighting your own inadequacies, you create a perfect excuse to stay isolated. If you believe you are fundamentally unlovable or socially awkward, then you never have to take the risk of reaching out to someone and being rejected. In this sense, self-loathing is a protective mechanism that ensures you never have to enter the arena of social interaction where the possibility of pain is always present. The philosopher points out that the fear of being disliked by others is so intense that people would rather reject themselves first as a preemptive strike. The dialogue further explores how we use our shortcomings as a shield. The philosopher explains that if you decide you are a failure because of your personality, you can stay in your shell and say that you would be successful if only you were different. This allows you to maintain a sense of potential without ever having to put it to the test. The youth is shocked by that interpretation because it implies that his deep sadness is not an accident, but a strategic choice he is making to keep himself safe from the judgment of the world. The philosopher asserts that to stop disliking yourself, you must first have the courage to step outside of your self-imposed isolation and accept that being hurt is an unavoidable part of living among other people. Chapter 12 is titled, All Problems Are Interpersonal Relationship Problems, and it presents what many consider to be the core tenet of Adlerian psychology. The philosopher makes the radical claim that if a person were truly alone in the universe and no other human being existed, then problems simply would not exist. He argues that even the problems we think are internal, such as loneliness or feelings of inferiority, are actually rooted in the existence of other people. Loneliness is not the absence of people, but the feeling of being excluded from a community. Similarly, feelings of inferiority only arise because we compare ourselves to others and feel that we are lacking in some way. The philosopher explains that we use the existence of others as a yardstick to measure our own worth, and this constant comparison is the source of all human suffering. The narrative goes on to explain that since we cannot live in a vacuum, we must learn how to navigate these relationships rather than trying to escape them. The youth finds it hard to believe that every single problem, from financial stress to health issues, is an interpersonal problem. However, the philosopher clarifies that even these issues are filtered through our social context. Financial stress is often about our status relative to others, and health issues involve our concern about being a burden or being seen as weak by society. By recognizing that all problems are interpersonal, the focus shifts from fixing one's internal self to changing how one relates to the world. The philosopher concludes by telling the youth that the only way to find true peace is to stop viewing other people as enemies or competitors, and to start viewing them as comrades. But this requires a fundamental shift in one's lifestyle and a willingness to face the complications of social life head-on. Chapter 13 is titled, Feelings of Inferiority Are Subjective Assumptions, and it tackles the internal psychological weight that many people carry throughout their lives. The philosopher explains that every human being starts life as a helpless infant, which naturally creates a baseline feeling of inferiority as we realize our limitations in a world of capable adults. However, he clarifies that this feeling is not a defect, but a healthy stimulus for growth and achievement. The problem arises when we stop viewing inferiority as a simple factual observation and start viewing it as a value judgment of our entire being. He argues that our feelings of being less than others are not objective truths like height or weight, but are subjective assumptions that we create based on our social comparisons. If you feel short, it is only because you are standing next to someone taller, and if you feel poor, it is only because you are measuring your bank account against someone wealthier. By recognizing that these feelings are subjective, we realize that we have the power to change our perspective and stop using them as a source of suffering. The dialogue highlights that the value we place on ourselves is entirely within our own control. The philosopher uses his own height as an example, noting that he used to feel inferior about being short until he realized that his size made people feel more relaxed and open around him. He transformed what he previously saw as a disadvantage into a social asset. This shift in thinking shows the youth that our traits are neutral, and it is only the meaning we assign to them that makes them positive or negative. The philosopher encourages the youth to see that his own feelings of inadequacy are not reflections of reality, but are tools he is using to maintain his current worldview. By choosing to see himself as inferior, he can justify his lack of action and his fear of participating in society. Chapter 14, titled An Inferiority Complex, is an excuse draws a sharp distinction between the common feeling of inferiority and the clinical inferiority complex. The philosopher explains that while feeling inferior can be a motivator to work harder, an inferiority complex is a state where a person uses their perceived weaknesses as an excuse to avoid the tasks of life. It is the mental process of saying, because I am not well educated, I cannot succeed, or because I am unattractive, I cannot find a partner. In Adlerian psychology, this is seen as an attempt to protect the ego from the possibility of failure. If you never try, you can never truly fail, and you can always hold on to the comforting thought that you would have been great if only you did not have that specific limitation. The complex is essentially a shield that allows a person to stay in their comfort zone while blaming their lack of progress on factors they claim are beyond their control. The narrative goes even further to describe the superiority complex, which is often just the flip side of the same coin. The philosopher argues that people who brag about their achievements or constantly drop names of important people are actually suffering from an intense sense of inferiority. They feel the need to manufacture a facade of greatness because they cannot accept themselves as they truly are. By acting superior, they are trying to hide their deep-seated fears of being ordinary or inadequate. The philosopher tells the youth that both complexes are ways of avoiding the hard work of self-improvement and real social contribution. True health is found in the pursuit of superiority, which is not about being better than others, but about constantly trying to become a better version of oneself. This chapter concludes by challenging the youth to drop his excuses and to realize that his perceived flaws are not walls blocking his path, but are hurdles that he is choosing not to jump. Chapter 15 is titled, Braggarts Have Feelings of Inferiority, and it explores the paradoxical behavior of individuals who go to great lengths to display their success or importance. The philosopher explains that if a person truly has confidence in their own worth, they feel no need to boast or to constantly seek validation from the outside world. He argues that the act of bragging is actually a sign of an underlying inferiority complex. When someone is plagued by the fear that they are not enough, they feel compelled to manufacture a facade of superiority to hide their perceived weaknesses. This might manifest as an obsession with brand name clothing, or a constant need to mention influential people they know. By surrounding themselves with external symbols of status, they are attempting to convince both themselves and others that they are of high value. The philosopher goes on to explain that this behavior is ultimately a trap because it makes one's sense of self entirely dependent on the recognition of others. If the praise stops, the person's self-worth collapses. He describes how some people even use their misfortune as a way to act superior by claiming that their suffering is deeper or more unique than anyone else's. This is what he calls the pursuit of superiority through misfortune, where a person uses their pain to gain power over others and make them feel guilty. The youth begins to see that both the person who brags about success and the person who brags about their trauma are doing the same thing, which is trying to use external circumstances to cover up a hollow sense of self. The chapter concludes by suggesting that true strength is quiet and does not require a witness to exist. Chapter 16 is titled, Life is Not a Competition, and it addresses one of the most destructive mindsets in modern society. The philosopher argues that as long as you view life as a race or a contest, you will never be free from interpersonal relationship problems. If you are constantly looking to see who is ahead of you and who is behind you, then every other person becomes a potential enemy or a threat to your status. Even your friends become people you secretly resent for their successes or pity for their failures. This competitive worldview creates a life of constant anxiety because there is always someone who is richer, smarter, or more attractive. The philosopher explains that the Adlerian view is to see all humans as equal but walking on a flat plane. Some may be further along in certain areas and others may be behind, but the goal is not to get ahead of others, but to move forward relative to where you were yesterday. The dialogue emphasizes that when you drop the mindset of competition, you are finally able to see other people as comrades rather than rivals. When you stop worrying about winning or losing, you can genuinely celebrate the successes of others without feeling like you have lost something yourself. The youth struggles with this because he has been raised in a world that prizes being number one. However, the philosopher points out that even the winner of a competition lives in fear of the day they will eventually lose. By stepping off the track of competition entirely, you enter a world where you are free to pursue your own goals at your own pace. This chapter serves as a vital lesson in shifting from a vertical relationship of hierarchy to a horizontal relationship of mutual respect and cooperation, where the only person you are truly trying to surpass is yourself. Chapter 17 is titled, You Are the Only One Worrying About Your Appearance, and it focuses on the internal anxiety many people feel regarding the judgment and observation of others. The philosopher explains to the youth that most of the self-consciousness we feel is a result of a self-centered worldview, where we imagine that the entire world is watching our every move and waiting for us to fail. He argues that in reality, other people are far too preoccupied with their own lives, their own problems, and their own appearances to spend much time thinking about yours. He uses the example of looking in a mirror and being obsessed with a small blemish that no one else would ever notice unless it was pointed out to them. This obsessive focus on how we are seen is actually a form of egoism because it assumes that we are the protagonist of everyone else's story when we are actually just a background character in theirs. The dialogue highlights that once you realize you are not the center of the universe, you gain a massive sense of relief. The philosopher explains that the fear of being judged is a major barrier to living a free and authentic life. By constantly wondering what others think of us, we are essentially living our lives for them rather than for ourselves. He encourages the youth to understand that while he might be his own harshest critic, the rest of the world is largely indifferent to his perceived flaws. This realization allows a person to step out of the shadows and participate in life without the constant weight of imagined surveillance. The philosopher suggests that the moment you stop worrying about your appearance is the moment you truly start to live. Chapter 18, titled From Power Struggle to Revenge, examines the darker side of interpersonal relationships and how conflicts often escalate from simple disagreements into destructive cycles of dominance. The philosopher describes how a disagreement can quickly turn into a power struggle, where the goal is no longer to find a solution, but to prove that you are right and the other person is wrong. He explains that once a person feels they have lost a power struggle, they often move into the next and more dangerous phase, which is the desire for revenge. This is not just about getting even, but about inflicting pain on the other person to compensate for one's own feelings of inferiority or defeat. This cycle is what leads to long-term resentment and the breakdown of families, friendships, and even nations. The narrative emphasizes that the only way to avoid these traps is to refuse to enter the competition in the first place. The philosopher argues that even if you are right and the other person is clearly wrong, there is no benefit in using that truth to crush them. By winning a power struggle, you are simply creating a new enemy who will eventually seek revenge. He suggests that we must have the courage to step away from the need to win and instead focus on the task at hand. This requires a high level of emotional intelligence and the ability to recognize when a conversation has shifted from a healthy exchange of ideas into a battle of egos. The philosopher concludes that true freedom in relationships comes from the ability to walk away from a fight without feeling like you have lost anything because your worth is not tied to the outcome of an argument. Chapter 19 is titled Admitting Fault is Not Defeat, and it provides a critical lesson on how to handle mistakes within the context of interpersonal relationships. The philosopher explains that many people view an apology or an admission of being wrong as a total loss of status or a sign of weakness. This perspective is rooted in a competitive worldview, where every interaction is seen as a win or a loss. He argues that the moment you think I must not be wrong, you have already entered into a power struggle. By refusing to admit a mistake, you are actually showing a lack of courage and a deep-seated fear of being seen as inferior. The philosopher asserts that admitting a fault is actually a sign of strength and high levels of financial or social intelligence because it shows that you value the relationship and the truth more than your own ego. The dialogue emphasizes that being right has nothing to do with winning or losing. Even if you are objectively correct, using that fact to beat someone else down only creates resentment and further conflict. The philosopher suggests that once we step away from the need to be perfect, we are able to see that an apology is a tool for reconciliation and growth rather than a mark of shame. He points out that the fear of admitting defeat is what keeps people trapped in dysfunctional patterns for years. By having the courage to say I was wrong, you break the cycle of power struggles and allow the relationship to move forward on a horizontal plane of mutual respect. This chapter concludes by reminding the youth that the only person he should be trying to surpass is his previous self, and admitting a fault is a necessary step in that personal evolution. Chapter 20 is titled Overcoming the Tasks That Face You in Life, and it introduces the Adlerian concept of the 3 life tasks, which are the task of work, the task of friendship, and the task of love. The philosopher explains that these are the fundamental social challenges that every human being must confront to live a fulfilling life. He argues that these tasks are not burdens, but opportunities to connect with the human community. The task of work is generally the easiest because it often involves clear rules and logical outcomes, but the tasks of friendship and love are more difficult because they require a higher degree of vulnerability and the risk of being disliked or rejected. The philosopher notes that most people who suffer from psychological distress are actually trying to avoid one or more of these life tasks. The narrative explores how individuals create excuses to run away from these challenges. For example, a person might become a workaholic to avoid the emotional intimacy required in the task of love, or someone might claim they are too busy with their career to maintain deep friendships. The philosopher calls this the life lie, which is the act of coming up with sophisticated justifications for why we cannot fulfill our social responsibilities. He tells the youth that happiness is found in the courage to face these tasks head-on, despite the possibility of failure. By engaging with work friends and partners, we contribute to the common good and find a sense of belonging. The chapter ends with the idea that we are not meant to be isolated islands, and that our growth as individuals is inextricably linked to how well we navigate the tasks that connect us to others. Chapter 21 is titled Red String and Rigid Chains, and it delves into the nature of human connections and the different ways we bind ourselves to others. The philosopher uses the metaphor of a red string to represent a healthy horizontal relationship based on mutual respect and freedom. In this type of connection, the string is loose and allows both individuals to move and grow independently while still remaining connected by a sense of companionship. On the other hand, he describes rigid chains as the symbol of vertical relationships, where one person seeks to control or possess the other. These chains are heavy and restrictive, often fueled by a desire for recognition or a fear of being alone. The philosopher explains that many people mistake the weight of these chains for the depth of their love or commitment, when in reality they are simply tools of restriction that prevent true personal development. The dialogue highlights that the goal of Adlerian psychology is to replace these rigid chains with the light and flexible red strings of horizontal connection. The philosopher argues that when you try to bind someone to you through guilt, obligation, or power, you are essentially treating them as an object rather than a person. This leads to a life of constant tension because the person being chained will eventually seek to break free. By contrast, a horizontal relationship requires the courage to trust the other person without trying to manage their behavior. The philosopher suggests that true intimacy is only possible when both parties are free to leave but choose to stay. And this shift in perspective is what allows a person to move from a state of dependency to a state of self-reliance and genuine social interest. Chapter 22 is titled Do Not Fall for the Life Lie, and it addresses the sophisticated psychological excuses we create to avoid our life tasks. The philosopher explains that the life lie is a mechanism where we pick out a specific person or a circumstance and use it as a reason for why we cannot be happy or why we cannot succeed. For example, a person might say they cannot get married because their parents had a bad divorce, or they cannot start a business because the economy is poor. While these facts might be true, using them as a total barrier to action is a lie. We tell ourselves to avoid the risk of failure. The philosopher asserts that we are essentially searching for reasons to dislike ourselves or our situations so that we can stay in our comfort zones without feeling guilty about our lack of progress. The narrative goes deeper into how we use the flaws of others to justify our own stagnation. The philosopher points out that if you decide you hate someone, you will find 100 reasons to justify that hatred, even if those reasons are trivial. This is a life lie used to avoid the task of friendship or love with that person. He tells the youth that instead of looking for causes in the past or in others, he must look at the goal he is currently trying to achieve by holding on to these negative views. Usually the goal is to avoid being hurt or to avoid the effort of change. By exposing the life lie, the philosopher is trying to show the youth that he has the power to redefine his relationships and his future at any moment. The chapter ends with the sobering reminder that while it is easy to blame the world for our unhappiness, It takes true courage to admit that we are the ones holding the pen and writing our own story. The 23rd chapter is titled From the Psychology of Possession to the Psychology of Practice, and it marks a major shift from understanding why we act to how we must live. The philosopher explains that most people are stuck in the psychology of possession, which is the belief that their happiness depends on what they were born with or what has happened to them in the past. He argues that it doesn't matter what a person is born with, but what use they make of that equipment. In the psychology of practice, life is seen as a skill that must be trained, rather than a fate that must be accepted. This means that even if a person has experienced trauma or has a difficult personality, they can still practice a new way of being. The youth finds this exhausting because it means he can no longer use his past as an excuse for his current situation. The dialogue emphasizes that our lives are not fixed or predetermined by our traits. The philosopher suggests that we are like artisans who must work with the materials we have been given to create something beautiful. He argues that focusing on what we lack or what we cannot change is a waste of energy that prevents us from engaging in the actual practice of living. By shifting the focus to practice, the philosopher is telling the youth that he has the power to change his lifestyle at any moment if he has the courage to stop obsessing over what he possesses and start focusing on what he does. This chapter sets the stage for the practical application of Adlerian principles in everyday life. Chapter 24 is titled, Deny the Desire for Recognition, and it presents one of the most challenging concepts in the entire book. The philosopher argues that the desire to be liked and recognized by others is actually a form of bondage that prevents a person from being truly free. He explains that when we live to satisfy the expectations of others, we are essentially living their lives instead of our own. He describes the reward and punishment system of society as a trap that makes us dependent on external validation. If we only do good things to be praised, then we are not acting out of our own internal values, but out of a desire for a reward. The youth is shocked by this idea because he believes that the pursuit of recognition is a natural and healthy human drive. The philosopher counters this by explaining that if you are constantly seeking approval, you are handing over the remote control of your life to other people. You become a slave to their opinions, and you lose the ability to make choices that are right for you. He suggests that we must have the courage to be disliked, because that is the only way to ensure we are living according to our own principles. To deny the desire for recognition is to claim your own independence and to stop treating other people as judges of your worth. This chapter concludes by introducing the idea that true freedom is not about being accepted by everyone, but about having the strength to walk your own path, regardless of what others think. Chapter 27 is titled, Do Not Live to Satisfy the Expectations of Others, and it serves as a wake-up call for those who feel burdened by the pressure of society and family. The philosopher explains that when you choose your actions based on what you think others want, you are essentially lying to yourself and to them. He argues that trying to meet everyone's expectations is an impossible task that leads to a life of constant anxiety and resentment. If you are a student studying a subject you hate just to please your parents, or if you are staying in a job you dislike to maintain a certain image, you are not living your own life. The philosopher asserts that we have no obligation to live up to what others expect of us, and conversely, others have no obligation to live up to our expectations. This realization is the first step toward genuine freedom because it breaks the cycle of external validation that keeps us trapped in a state of dependency. The dialogue highlights that the desire to be a good person in the eyes of others is often just a mask for the fear of being disliked. The philosopher suggests that true individuality requires the courage to be honest about your own desires, even if they conflict with the wishes of those around you. He explains that while it might feel selfish to prioritize your own path, it is actually the most responsible thing you can do because you are the only one who has to live with the consequences of your choices. By refusing to be a puppet for the expectations of others, you reclaim your agency and start to build a life that is based on your own internal values. This chapter forces the youth to confront the uncomfortable truth that his current unhappiness is partly due to his own refusal to claim his independence. Chapter 28 is titled How to Separate Tasks, and it introduces the specific technique used to navigate the social pressures discussed in the previous chapter. The philosopher explains that the separation of tasks is the starting point for all interpersonal peace. To apply this, you must ask yourself, whose task is this, by identifying who will receive the end result of the choice being made? For example, a child's education is the child's task, not the parent's task. While a parent can offer support and guidance, the ultimate decision to study and the consequences of not studying belong to the child. The philosopher argues that almost all interpersonal conflicts arise because people intrude on the tasks of others, or allow others to intrude on their own tasks. By clearly defining these boundaries, you can stop carrying the emotional weight of problems that do not belong to you. The narrative provides a practical framework for letting go of the need for approval. The philosopher explains that whether or not someone likes you is their task, not yours. Your task is to live your life in a way that you believe is right, and how other people react to that is entirely out of your control. By separating these tasks, you are freed from the exhaustion of trying to manage the emotions and opinions of every person you meet. The youth finds this concept difficult to accept because it seems cold or detached, but the philosopher clarifies that it is actually a form of deep respect for the autonomy of others. It allows you to offer help without being overbearing and to receive criticism without being devastated. This chapter concludes by emphasizing that the separation of tasks is the only way to simplify the complexities of human relationships and to find the mental space necessary for personal growth. Chapter 29 is titled How to Rid Yourself of Interpersonal Relationship Problems, and it focuses on the practical application of the separation of tasks as a master key to mental peace. The philosopher explains that most of our stress comes from worrying about things we cannot control, such as whether our boss likes our work or whether our parents approve of our lifestyle. He argues that by clearly identifying what is your task and what is the task of the other person, you can immediately strip away the majority of your emotional burdens. If you are doing your best at your job, then performing well is your task. But how your boss evaluates that performance is their task. By letting go of the boss's task, you are no longer a victim of their mood or their judgment. This allows you to work with a sense of internal integrity rather than a constant fear of rejection. The dialogue emphasizes that separating tasks is not about being cold or ignoring others, but about reclaiming the energy you waste on useless interventions. The philosopher points out that when we try to take on someone else's task, we are essentially being manipulative because we are trying to force a specific outcome in their mind. This creates tension and conflict because no one likes to be controlled. By sticking strictly to your own tasks, you create a space of freedom for yourself and those around you. The youth finds this liberating but also terrifying because it means he is solely responsible for his own happiness and can no longer blame others for his feelings of inadequacy. The philosopher concludes that the secret to a simple and peaceful life is to stop sticking your nose into other people's business and to stop letting them stick theirs into yours. Chapter 30 is titled Cut the Gordian Knot, and it uses the famous historical legend to illustrate how we should handle complex and messy relationships. The philosopher explains that many people spend years trying to untangle the complicated knots of their interpersonal problems, through endless talking and overthinking. He suggests that instead of trying to untangle the knot, we should simply cut it through a decisive act of separation. This means making a clean break from the need for recognition and the habit of interfering in the tasks of others. Cutting the Gordian knot is an act of courage, where you decide that the opinions of others will no longer dictate your choices. It is a radical simplification of life that allows you to move forward without being held back by the strings of social obligation. The narrative goes on to explain that this cutting process is necessary to break free from vertical relationships, where power and status are the primary concerns. The philosopher argues that as long as you are trying to untangle the expectations of your family or society, you will remain paralyzed. By cutting the knot, you are choosing to enter into horizontal relationships based on mutual respect and equality. The youth is concerned that this might lead to isolation, but the philosopher assures him that true connection is only possible between two independent individuals who have already cut their own knots. This chapter serves as a call to action to stop being a slave to complexity and to embrace the simple and direct path of self-reliance. By the end of this discussion, the youth begins to understand that his life is only as complicated as he chooses to make it, and that the power to simplify everything lies in his own hands. Chapter 31 is titled Desire for Recognition Makes You Unfree, and it connects the previous discussion on the separation of tasks to the fundamental concept of human liberty. The philosopher explains that if you are living to be praised or to avoid being criticized, you are essentially a puppet being pulled by the strings of other people's opinions. He argues that the desire for recognition is a form of self-centeredness because you are constantly monitoring how you are being perceived rather than focusing on your own contribution to the world. When your happiness depends on the approval of a boss, a parent, or a peer, you have surrendered your autonomy and are living in a state of constant anxiety. The philosopher asserts that true freedom is impossible as long as you are chasing the phantom of recognition, because you will always be forced to suppress your true self to satisfy the tastes and expectations of others. The dialogue highlights that the need for recognition often stems from a fear of being ordinary, or a deep sense of inferiority. The philosopher suggests that by seeking external validation, we are trying to compensate for a lack of internal self-worth. He explains that a person who is truly self-reliant does not need the world to applaud their actions, because they are satisfied with the inherent value of their own tasks. The youth finds this idea deeply challenging because it implies that his lifelong ambition to be someone special is actually a form of psychological chains. This chapter forces the youth to see that the very thing he thought would make him happy, the respect and admiration of society, is the very thing that is keeping him from being a free and authentic individual. Chapter 32 is titled What Real Freedom Is, and it provides the famous Adlerian definition of liberty that gives the book its name. The philosopher explains that freedom is not the absence of obstacles, or the ability to do whatever one wants without consequence. Instead, he defines freedom as the courage to be disliked by others. He argues that if you are not being disliked by anyone, it is a sign that you are living your life to please everyone, and are therefore not free. Being disliked is proof that you are exercising your own individual will and living according to your own principles rather than bending to the will of the collective. The philosopher tells the youth that while it is painful to be misunderstood or rejected, it is the necessary price one must pay to live a life that is truly their own. The narrative emphasizes that you should not seek out being disliked on purpose, but you must be willing to accept it as a byproduct of being yourself. The philosopher explains that real freedom is found in the separation of tasks, where you realize that whether someone likes you or not is their task, and not your responsibility. By accepting this, you are finally able to walk away from the vertical competition of status and recognition. The youth is moved by this revelation, but also intimidated by the sheer amount of courage it requires to stop caring about the judgment of the world. The philosopher concludes the chapter by stating that happiness is only possible for those who have the strength to be disliked, because only then are they free from the external pressures that distort the human soul. Chapter 33 is titled, "You Hold the Cards to Interpersonal Relationships," and it serves as a powerful reminder of personal agency within our social lives. The philosopher explains that as long as we believe our relationships are determined by the actions of others, we remain in a state of helplessness. He argues that by applying the separation of tasks, you realize that you are the only one who can decide how you will relate to someone else, regardless of how they treat you. For example, if you decide to mend a broken relationship with a parent, the success of that effort is not measured by whether the parent accepts you, but by your own decision to reach out. By taking initiative, you are holding the cards because your internal state is no longer dependent on the other person's reaction. The philosopher asserts that the goal of a relationship is not to change the other person, but to change yourself and your own way of being. The dialogue highlights that when you stop waiting for the other person to change, you are suddenly free to act with integrity. The philosopher suggests that the feeling of being stuck in a relationship is often a result of waiting for the other person to make the first move, which is a form of giving away your power. He tells the youth that by deciding for himself how he wants to conduct his life, he is effectively taking back control of his social world. This doesn't mean you can control the outcome of the relationship, but it means you can control your own contribution to it. This chapter encourages the youth to see that he is the protagonist of his own life, and that he has the authority to define his relationships on his own terms, starting from this very moment. Chapter 34 is titled Individual Psychology and Holism, and it explains the etymological and philosophical roots of Adlerian thought. The philosopher points out that the word individual comes from the Latin meaning indivisible, which reflects the core belief that a person cannot be broken down into competing parts, like the conscious and unconscious or the mind and body. He argues against the Freudian view that we are battlegrounds for internal conflicts, and instead proposes that we are a single unified entity moving toward a specific goal. This is what Adler called holism, which is the understanding that every thought, emotion, and physical symptom is a manifestation of the person's entire lifestyle. If you are angry, it is not because your temper took over, but because you as a whole person chose to use anger to achieve a specific social goal. The narrative emphasizes that by viewing yourself as a unified whole, you can no longer blame your impulses or your past for your behavior. The philosopher explains that we are not driven by internal machinery that we cannot control, but are instead self-determining beings who move as one. This holistic view is essential for taking responsibility because it removes the excuse of saying I didn't mean to do that, or my heart said one thing but my head said another. He tells the youth that everything he does is a reflection of his own intentions and his own chosen direction. This chapter challenges the youth to accept that he is a complete and integrated being, and that his path in life is a direct result of the choices he makes as a whole person. By accepting holism, he is forced to confront the fact that there is no part of himself that is not under his own influence. Chapter 35 is titled, The Goal of Interpersonal Relationships is a Feeling of Community, and it introduces the concept of social interest as the ultimate destination of the Adlerian journey. The philosopher explains that while the separation of tasks is the starting point, the feeling of community is the goal. He describes this not as a narrow loyalty to one's family or local group, but as a sense of belonging to the entire universe, including all living beings, and even inanimate objects. This community feeling is the antidote to the feelings of inferiority and isolation that haunt the youth. The philosopher argues that when you see others as comrades rather than enemies, you are able to find a home in the world and contribute to the well-being of others without expecting anything in return. This chapter challenges the youth to expand his perspective beyond his own ego and to realize that his value is found in his connection to the greater whole. The dialogue emphasizes that community feeling is something that must be cultivated through the practice of horizontal relationships. The philosopher suggests that by treating every person as an equal, you create a space where everyone can belong. He explains that true happiness is found when you can say, "I am of use to the community." This sense of being useful provides a person with a quiet confidence that does not rely on the praise or recognition of others. The youth is skeptical of such a grand and abstract idea, but the philosopher insists that even the smallest act of contribution can spark a feeling of belonging. By shifting the focus from what the world can give you to what you can give the world, you finally break free from the trap of self-centeredness and find a lasting sense of peace. Chapter 36 is titled, "Why Am I Only Interested in Myself?" and it provides a blunt analysis of the youth's internal struggles. The philosopher explains that self-loathing and the constant desire for recognition are actually two sides of the same coin, which is an intense preoccupation with the self. He argues that when you are constantly worried about how you are being judged, or whether you are special, you are not actually interested in others, but are only interested in how you appear in their eyes. This type of self-centeredness is what leads to interpersonal problems because you view other people as mere tools for your own validation or as threats to your status. The philosopher tells the youth that his obsession with his own flaws is not a sign of humility, but a sign of an ego that is still trying to be the protagonist of every story. The narrative goes deeper into how this self-interest prevents the development of community feeling. The philosopher explains that a person who is only interested in themselves is always in a state of lack because they are constantly looking for something from the outside to fill their internal void. He suggests that to overcome this, you must stop asking, "What can this person do for me?" and start asking, "What can I do for this person?" This shift from taking to giving is the only way to heal the sense of isolation that the youth feels. The philosopher asserts that you are not the center of the world, but a part of it, and once you accept your place as a single member of a vast community, your anxiety will naturally begin to fade. This chapter serves as a mirror for the youth, forcing him to see that his misery is a result of his own inward focus, and that his liberation depends on his ability to turn his gaze outward toward others. Chapter 37 is titled, "You Are Not the Center of the World," and it addresses the common human tendency to view ourselves as the main character of the universe. The philosopher explains that while you are the protagonist of your own life story, you are merely a single member of a vast community when viewed from the outside. He points out that people who are obsessed with how they look or what others think of them are living in a self-centered reality, where they expect the world to revolve around their needs. When the world fails to accommodate them, or when people do not give them the recognition they desire, they feel deeply offended and retreat into misery. The philosopher argues that this is because they mistake their place in the world, believing they are the center of the community rather than just a part of it. The dialogue highlights that finding your true place requires a shift from a mindset of possession to a mindset of belonging. The philosopher suggests that you do not gain a sense of belonging simply by existing or waiting for others to welcome you. Instead, you must actively earn your place in the community by contributing to it and treating others as equals. He tells the youth that as long as he expects others to serve his emotional needs, he will always be disappointed. By accepting that you are not the center of the world, you lose the burden of needing to control everything and everyone around you. This chapter encourages the youth to see that stepping down from his imaginary throne is the only way to build genuine horizontal connections and to find a true home among others. Chapter 38 is titled, Listen to the Voice of a Larger Community, and it provides a practical guide on how to handle conflicts within a small social group. The philosopher explains that when we face trouble in a specific environment such as a school, a workplace, or a family, we often feel that our entire world is collapsing. He argues that this panic happens because we view that small group as the boundary of our entire universe. To counter this, the philosopher introduces the Adlerian principle of looking at the larger community. If you are being bullied at school, or if your boss treats you unfairly at work, you must realize that there is a massive world outside of that specific building. By listening to the voice of a larger community, you understand that the rules and judgments of your current troublesome group are not absolute truths. The narrative goes deeper into how this broader perspective grants us the courage to act with integrity. The philosopher explains that if a relationship within a small community can only be maintained by sacrificing your own principles or by submitting to a vertical power struggle, then it is a relationship you should walk away from. Knowing that a larger community exists gives you the strength to say no to local tyranny and to seek connections elsewhere. The youth finds this liberating because it means he is never truly trapped by his current circumstances or the opinions of a few people. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that whenever we encounter friction in our immediate surroundings, we must lift our heads and remember that we belong to something much bigger, and this wider view is what allows us to maintain our freedom and our sense of value. Chapter 39 is titled, Do Not Rebuke or Praise, and it introduces a revolutionary perspective on how we interact with and evaluate others. The philosopher explains that both rebuking and praising are actually methods used in vertical relationships to manipulate and control people. When you praise someone by saying "well done," you are passing judgment from a position of superiority, implying that you are higher up in the hierarchy than the person you are praising. This creates a dynamic of reward and punishment, where the person being praised begins to view themselves as inferior and dependent on your approval. The philosopher argues that the goal of Adlerian psychology is to build horizontal relationships based on equality, where we neither look down on others with rebuke nor look up to them with a desire for praise. The dialogue highlights that praise is a tool that breeds dependency and a fear of failure. The philosopher suggests that when we praise a child or a colleague, we are essentially trying to manage their behavior to fit our own expectations. This reinforces the desire for recognition which, as discussed before, makes a person unfree. He tells the youth that instead of judging others through praise or rebuke, we must learn to interact on a horizontal plane where we respect the autonomy of the other person. By eliminating praise, you stop reinforcing the idea that one's worth is tied to the approval of a superior. This chapter challenges the youth to reconsider his own habits of seeking and giving praise, forcing him to see it not as an act of kindness, but as an act of hidden manipulation. Chapter 40 is titled The Encouragement Approach, and it provides the alternative to the manipulative cycle of praise and rebuke. The philosopher explains that instead of praising someone for their achievements, you should offer encouragement, which focuses on gratitude and the value of the person's contribution. When you say "thank you" or "you really helped me out," you are speaking from a horizontal position of equality. You are not passing judgment on the person's ability, but are simply expressing how their actions impacted the community. This approach helps the other person develop a sense of self-worth that is rooted in their usefulness rather than the approval of others. The philosopher asserts that encouragement gives a person the courage to face their life tasks, because it reminds them that they already possess the ability to contribute. The narrative goes deeper into how encouragement fosters self-reliance and community feeling. The philosopher explains that while praise makes a person dependent on external rewards, encouragement empowers them to rely on their own internal motivation. He suggests that the most effective way to help someone who is struggling is not to fix their problems or judge their efforts, but to offer horizontal support that builds their confidence. The youth struggles to understand how expressing gratitude differs fundamentally from praise, but the philosopher clarifies that gratitude acknowledges equality, while praise reinforces a hierarchy. This chapter concludes by emphasizing that the encouragement approach is the key to unlocking a person's potential and helping them find happiness through service to others. Chapter 41 is titled How to Feel You Have Value, and it addresses the deep internal struggle of finding self-worth without relying on the approval of others. The philosopher explains that a person can only feel their own value when they realize that their actions are useful to the community. He reminds the youth that this usefulness should not be measured by external praise or visible achievements, which are markers of a vertical relationship. Instead, value is felt through the subjective realization that you are contributing to the common good on a horizontal plane. When you focus on being of service, you stop questioning your right to exist and start experiencing a natural sense of belonging. The philosopher argues that self-worth is not something you receive from the outside world, but something you experience internally when you actively engage in the task of helping others. The dialogue highlights that many people fail to feel their value because they look for it in the wrong places. The philosopher suggests that as long as you are waiting for someone else to tell you that you are valuable, you will always be in a state of insecurity. He tells the youth that the moment you shift your mindset from what can I take to what can I give you immediately, unlock the ability to feel your own worth. This contribution does not have to be a grand gesture. Even a simple act of kindness or fulfilling your daily responsibilities at work or home is a valid form of service. This chapter forces the youth to see that the key to overcoming his self-loathing is entirely in his own hands and is achieved by looking outward to see how he can benefit the people around him. Chapter 42 is titled Exist in the Present, and it expands on the idea of human value by shifting the focus from doing to being. The philosopher explains that a person's worth is not merely tied to their level of productivity or their physical actions. He argues that we have immense value simply by existing as a part of the community. To illustrate this, he uses the example of an elderly grandparent or a bedridden relative who can no longer work or perform chores. From a purely functional perspective, they might seem to be contributing nothing, but their simple existence brings joy, comfort, and meaning to their family. The philosopher asserts that if we only value people for what they can do, we create a cruel hierarchy that leaves no room for vulnerability or aging. The narrative goes deeper into how this radical concept applies to self-acceptance. The philosopher explains that you must learn to look at yourself not from the level of acts, but from the level of being. This means accepting your existence as a human being as inherently valuable, regardless of your current failures or lack of achievements. The youth struggles with this idea because he has spent his entire life believing he must prove his worth through constant effort and competition. The philosopher clarifies that true peace comes from dropping these impossible standards and realizing that you do not need to perform to justify your place in the universe. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that by anchoring your value in your mere existence in the present moment, you free yourself from the anxiety of the future and the regrets of the past. Chapter 43 is titled People Cannot Make Proper Use of Self, and it explores the psychological blockages that prevent individuals from directing their energy outward. The philosopher explains that many people fail to fulfill their potential because they are constantly fighting an internal battle against their own perceived flaws. He argues that when you are consumed by self-loathing, you are wasting your limited emotional and mental resources on a useless cycle of self-monitoring. This internal fixation makes it impossible to make proper use of your abilities because you are too busy protecting your ego from the threat of failure. The philosopher asserts that your traits and talents are neutral tools, and the only thing that matters is how you choose to apply them to the tasks of life. By obsessing over what you lack, you essentially paralyze yourself and ensure that your equipment remains completely unused. The dialogue highlights that the inability to use oneself effectively is often a choice driven by the fear of responsibility. The philosopher suggests that as long as a person can say, "I have potential, but I am just not using it," they can maintain a comforting illusion of future greatness. The moment they actually try and face the reality of their current skill level, that illusion is shattered. He tells the youth that to make proper use of self, one must have the courage to accept their current starting point without shame. This requires moving away from the mindset of possession, where you constantly count what you are missing, and moving into the mindset of practice, where you focus entirely on what you can do with what you have right now. This chapter challenges the youth to realize that his inaction is not a result of a lack of talent, but a result of his own misuse of his psychological energy. Chapter 44 is titled, "Excessive Self-Consciousness Stifles the Self," and it focuses on how an intense awareness of how we appear to others completely paralyzes our natural behavior. The philosopher explains that when you enter a social situation with excessive self-consciousness, your attention is turned entirely inward. You are not listening to the conversation or engaging with the people around you. Instead, you are constantly asking yourself, "How do I look? What do they think of me? And am I making a mistake?" This hyper-awareness creates an artificial barrier between you and the community, making your movements rigid and your speech awkward. The philosopher argues that this is the ultimate form of self-centeredness, because even though you might feel shy or humble, you are actually acting as if you are the focal point of everyone else's attention. The narrative goes deeper into how this stifling consciousness can be broken by turning your focus outward toward others. The philosopher explains that when you are truly interested in the well-being of your companion or the task at hand, your self-consciousness naturally evaporates. He suggests that the secret to natural and free behavior is to stop treating social interactions as a stage where you are being judged and to start treating them as an opportunity to offer horizontal support. The youth recognizes this pattern in his own life, admitting that his shyness often locks him in a prison of his own thoughts. The philosopher concludes by telling him that the only way to free the self from this suffocation is to develop community feeling, where you view others as comrades who are not there to criticize you, but to walk alongside you on a flat plane of equality. Chapter 45 is titled, "Not Self-Affirmation, Self-Acceptance," and it clears up a major misconception about how to develop a healthy relationship with oneself. The philosopher explains that many popular self-help trends advocate for self-affirmation, which involves telling yourself statements like, "I can do it," or "I am strong," even when you do not truly believe them. He argues that this is a form of self-deception that actually reinforces your insecurities, because you are trying to convince yourself of an illusion. Self-acceptance, on the other hand, means looking at yourself honestly, acknowledging your limitations and accepting your current state without any judgment or fabrication. If you score a 60 on a test, self-affirmation is telling yourself, "I am a genius who just had a bad day," while self-acceptance is admitting I got a 60 because I didn't study enough and deciding how to improve next time. The dialogue highlights that self-acceptance requires the courage to be ordinary, and to accept the things you cannot change while focusing your energy entirely on the things you can change. The philosopher suggests that we cannot change our genetic makeup, our past experiences, or the actions of other people, but we can always change our own attitude and our next steps. He tells the youth that by dropping the pressure to be perfect or special, you clear away the mental clutter that keeps you stuck. This shift allows you to move from a state of constant anxiety to a state of practical action. This chapter forces the youth to see that true confidence does not come from inflating his ego with false praise, but from having the grounded courage to face his reality exactly as it is. Chapter 46 is titled The Difference Between Trust and Confidence, and it applies this foundation of self-acceptance to our relationships with others. The philosopher explains that in Adlerian psychology, there is a sharp distinction between confidence, which is based on conditions or proof, and trust, which is completely unconditional. He argues that confidence is what you have when you look at a bank statement before lending money, or when you judge someone based on their past behavior. Trust, however, means believing in someone without asking for any collateral or guarantees. The philosopher asserts that to build deep horizontal relationships and find a true sense of community, you must have the courage to extend unconditional trust to others, even though there is always a risk that you might be betrayed or let down. The narrative goes deeper into how this distinction affects our emotional freedom. The philosopher explains that whether the other person betrays your trust or not is their task, not yours. Your task is simply to decide whether you want to trust them. If you refuse to trust people until they prove their worth to you, you are living in a state of constant suspicion and calculation, which cuts you off from genuine connection. The youth is highly resistant to this idea, arguing that unconditional trust is naive and will only lead to being taken advantage of by society. The philosopher counters by explaining that trust is not a declaration of blindness, but a choice of lifestyle. By choosing to trust others unconditionally, you stop viewing them as potential enemies and start viewing them as comrades, which is the only way to overcome loneliness and build a true feeling of community. Chapter 47 is titled, The Essence of Work, is a contribution to the common good, and it provides a radical redefinition of labor that shifts the focus away from money and status. The philosopher explains that many people view work merely as a means to earn a living or as a competitive ladder to climb to prove their superiority over others. He argues that the true psychological purpose of work is to experience a sense of belonging by being useful to the human community. When you perform a job, you are not just trading your time for financial capital, you are actively participating in the maintenance and growth of society. The philosopher asserts that even the most mundane or behind-the-scenes labor has immense value because it supports the collective whole, and this realization is what allows a person to feel their own worth on a horizontal plane. The dialogue highlights that contribution to others does not mean sacrificing your own happiness or wiping yourself out for the sake of a company. The philosopher suggests that true contribution is actually an act of self-acceptance and trust, where you use your unique abilities to serve the community because you want to, not because you are forced to. He tells the youth that when you work with this mindset, you are no longer dependent on the praise of your boss or the recognition of your peers. Your satisfaction comes from the internal awareness that your efforts have made life easier or better for someone else. This chapter challenges the youth to look at his own career anxieties and to see that fulfillment is not found in becoming famous or powerful, but in the quiet dignity of knowing that your daily labor serves the common good. Chapter 48 is titled, Young People Walk Ahead of Adults, and it concludes this section of the dialogue with a powerful message about cultural evolution and the capacity for change. The philosopher explains that adults are often trapped in the rigid chains of past traditions vertical hierarchies, and the life lie because they have spent decades conditioning themselves to seek recognition and avoid risk. Young people, on the other hand, possess a natural flexibility and a proximity to the truth because they have not yet been fully broken by the competitive demands of society. He argues that progress does not happen by waiting for older generations to change their ways, but by young people having the courage to live according to horizontal principles right now. The philosopher tells the youth that he does not need the permission or the approval of adults to start building a free and authentic life. The narrative emphasizes that leadership in personal development belongs to those who are willing to take the first step, regardless of their age or social standing. The philosopher explains that when a young person chooses to practice self-acceptance, extend unconditional trust, and focus on contribution, they become a beacon of change that influences everyone around them. The youth is deeply moved by this idea, realizing that his youth is not a disadvantage or a state of ignorance, but a powerful window of opportunity to redefine his destiny. The philosopher concludes by reminding him that the task of changing the world starts with the individual, and that by walking ahead of the adults who are stuck in their ways, the youth can create a new reality based on mutual respect and genuine community feeling. Chapter 49 is titled, Workaholism is a Life Lie, and it tackles a very common modern behavior that society often praises, but Adlerian psychology views with deep suspicion. The philosopher explains that people who bury themselves completely in their jobs to the exclusion of everything else are not actually being responsible or productive. Instead, they are using their career as a giant excuse to escape from their other vital responsibilities, which are the tasks of friendship and love. By claiming that they are too busy with work, they avoid the emotional vulnerability required to maintain deep personal relationships or face family dynamics. The philosopher asserts that workaholism is a classic manifestation of the life lie because it takes one specific aspect of existence and uses it to justify the total neglect of a balanced human life. The dialogue highlights that a workaholic is often someone who is obsessed with a vertical worldview, where they must constantly perform to prove their worth and earn recognition. The philosopher suggests that this behavior is driven by a profound fear of being ordinary and an inability to accept oneself outside of a professional title. He tells the youth that true contribution to the common good does not mean wiping yourself out or destroying your personal life for a company. By reducing your entire identity to your job, you become extremely fragile because if your career fails or when you eventually retire, your entire sense of self-worth collapses. This chapter forces the youth to see that a truly successful life requires the courage to step away from the office and face all three life tasks with equal dedication. Chapter 50 is titled, You Can Be Happy Now, and it delivers the ultimate liberating conclusion of the entire text by shattering the idea that happiness is a distant goal we must chase. The philosopher explains that many people live their lives as if they are climbing a mountain, believing that they will only find true joy once they reach the summit. This perspective turns the present moment into a mere instrument or a painful waiting room for a future that may never arrive. He proposes instead that life is not a linear line but a series of dots representing individual moments called the eternal now. Life is like dancing or playing music where the purpose is not to reach the end of the song or the other side of the room, but to enjoy and experience every single movement as it happens. The narrative emphasizes that because life exists only in the present moment, you do not need to achieve great wealth, fame, or perfection before you are allowed to be happy. The philosopher explains that the moment you choose self-acceptance, unconditional trust, and contribution to others, you are already happy right then and there. You do not need to wait for the world to change or for someone else to give you permission to feel fulfilled. The youth finally understands that his deep unhappiness was caused by his own habit of looking back at his past with regret and looking forward to the future with anxiety, while completely ignoring the power he holds in the present. The chapter and the dialogue conclude with the powerful reminder that the greatest lie of all is to live in yesterday or tomorrow, and that true freedom and peace are always available to you the very instant you decide to claim them. Chapter 51 is titled Life is a Series of Moments, and it uses the metaphor of a stage to explain how we should approach our daily existence. The philosopher explains that many people view life as a long highway or a mountain climb where the only thing that matters is reaching the final destination. He argues that this perspective is completely wrong and leads to a life of constant postponement, where a person thinks their real life will only begin once they get a promotion, find a partner, or achieve a certain status. Instead, the philosopher proposes that life is like a theatrical performance, a dance, or a piece of music. The purpose of a dance is not to reach a specific spot on the floor, but to enjoy every single movement as it happens. Life is a collection of individual dots representing the eternal now, and if you are living intensely in this exact moment, you are already living completely. The dialogue highlights that when you look at life as a series of moments, the concept of a past and a future completely dissolves. The philosopher suggests that planning for the future or regretting the past is a way of avoiding the reality of the present. He tells the youth that by turning on the bright spotlights of the stage onto the here and now, the past and the future fade into darkness. You cannot see what lies ahead or behind, and you do not need to. All you have to do is focus on the task that is right in front of you with total sincerity and dedication. This chapter encourages the youth to stop treating his current life as a waiting room for some future greatness, and to realize that the quality of his life is decided by how he chooses to spend this very second. Chapter 52 is titled Touch a Light to the Life of the Here and Now, and it serves as the ultimate conclusion to the entire five-night dialogue. The philosopher addresses the youth's final anxiety, which is the question of the meaning of life. He states flatly that, universally speaking, life has no inherent meaning. There is no grand cosmic plan or destiny laid out for us. However, he quickly follows this by explaining that because life has no objective meaning, you are entirely free to assign your own meaning to it. The philosopher introduces the concept of the guiding star, which in Adlerian psychology is contribution to others. As long as your ultimate goal is to be of use to the community, you can never truly lose your way, no matter how much you are disliked or how many mistakes you make. The narrative reaches its emotional peak as the youth finally internalizes the philosopher's words. The philosopher explains that change does not require years of therapy or a shift in the global order. It requires a single decisive choice in the present moment. He reminds the youth that if he changes, the entire world changes for him, because the world is not an objective reality, but something filtered through his own subjective lenses. The dialogue ends with a powerful call to action to step out of the shadows of fear, to claim the courage to be disliked, and to start writing a new story on a clean slate. The youth thanks the philosopher for the intense debate and steps out into the crisp night air, finally feeling a deep sense of peace, self-reliance, and readiness to face the tasks of life. Chapter 53 is titled Life is a Series of Moments, and it expands on the radical shift from linear thinking to situational thinking. The philosopher explains that most people are trapped in what he calls a kinetic lifestyle, where they treat life as a straight line stretching from the past into the future. In this flawed view, the present moment is merely a tool or a milestone passed along the journey toward a distant goal, such as completing a degree, securing a promotion, or reaching retirement. The philosopher argues that this linear perspective turns the majority of a person's life into a painful waiting room or an incomplete state of being, where true living is constantly postponed until the destination is reached. If you do not reach that specific destination, your entire journey is suddenly viewed as a tragic failure. The dialogue counters this kinetic view by introducing the Adlerian concept of an energetic lifestyle, which conceptualizes life as a dense collection of individual dots rather than a continuous line. Each dot represents the absolute present, the eternal now. The philosopher explains that when you look at life through this lens, the past and the future effectively cease to exist. You cannot change what happened in a previous dot, and you cannot predict what will happen in a future dot. Therefore, planning for a distant future with rigid expectations or obsessing over past trauma are both ways of avoiding the reality of the immediate task at hand. By training your focus intensely on the single dot you occupy right now, you enter a state of complete and authentic existence where your life is already fulfilled at every second. Chapter 54 is titled Live Like You're Dancing, and it uses artistic metaphors to illustrate how an energetic lifestyle functions in practice. The philosopher explains that life should not be approached like a marathon, where the only purpose is to cross the finish line. Instead, it should be approached like dancing or playing a piece of music. When a person dances, their goal is not to reach a specific coordinate on the dance floor or to finish the song as quickly as possible. The purpose of the dance is the act of dancing itself, and every single step taken is complete in its own right. If a musician plays a symphony, the goal is not to reach the final chord, but to execute every note with sincerity and passion. If the music stops halfway through, the performance is not considered a failure, because every note played up to that point held intrinsic value. The narrative emphasizes that living like you are dancing removes the burden of needing to achieve greatness or become a special being to justify your existence. The philosopher tells the youth that if you are living intensely in the here and now, the simple acts of eating a meal, walking down the street, or having a conversation become complete and meaningful experiences. This is what Adlerian psychology refers to as the active nature of life, where the quality of your destiny is decided entirely by your sincerity toward the present dot. The youth finally understands that his chronic unhappiness was a result of his refusal to dance in his current circumstances, as he was too busy staring at a future summit he had not yet reached. The chapter concludes by showing that by fully embracing the rhythm of the present moment, you strip away the anxiety of judgment and discover the ultimate freedom to shape your life as a continuous, joyful expression of the now. Chapter 55 is titled, Shine a Light on the Here and Now, and it focuses on the intense psychological focus required to break free from the paralyzing weight of both past regrets and future anxieties. The philosopher uses the vivid metaphor of being on a theater stage to explain how humans mistakenly perceive their own existence. When you look out from a stage into a dimly lit auditorium, you can see the vague shapes of the audience and your mind wanders to what lies out there in the shadows. However, if a powerful, blinding spotlight is turned on and focused directly on you, the rest of the theater completely vanishes into total darkness. You can no longer see the front row, the back row, or the exit signs. Your entire reality shrinks down to the small circle of light illumination beneath your feet. The dialogue explains that shining a light on the here and now means applying this exact level of hyperfocus to your immediate daily tasks. The philosopher argues that most people live with the house lights turned up, constantly staring back at the dark shadows of their past mistakes, or looking ahead into the misty, uncertain future of their goals and fears. This lack of focus creates a blurry, diluted existence, where the present moment is treated as nothing more than a bridge to somewhere else. By focusing the spotlight entirely on the current dot of time, you effectively erase the past and the future from your immediate consciousness. You do not need to worry about how you arrived at this point, nor do you need to calculate how you will get to the next destination. Your only responsibility is to execute the task right in front of you with total sincerity and dedication, whether that means studying a single page of a book, washing a dish, or having an honest conversation with a friend. Chapter 56 is titled The Greatest Life Lie, and it delivers the final definitive critique of human avoidance before presenting the ultimate path to personal liberation. The philosopher states with absolute clarity that looking at life as a finished product, or a linear line stretching from yesterday to tomorrow, is the foundational deception that keeps humanity in chains. He defines the greatest life lie as the act of living in the past or the future, while treating the present moment as a mere instrument. When you tell yourself that your real life will begin once you get a better job, move to a new place, or find the perfect relationship, you are actively lying to yourself to avoid the responsibility of living right now. You are creating a psychological excuse for your current unhappiness, blaming your circumstances or your history instead of claiming your agency in the immediate present. The narrative reaches its ultimate climax as the philosopher dismantles the idea of an inherent, cosmic meaning to life. He asserts that, universally speaking, life has no objective meaning or pre-written destiny. This realization is initially terrifying to the youth, who has spent his life searching for a grand purpose to justify his existence. However, the philosopher explains that this absence of a cosmic blueprint is actually the ultimate form of freedom. Because life has no inherent meaning, you are given a completely blank canvas to assign your own subjective meaning to every moment you live. To navigate this absolute freedom without losing yourself, the philosopher introduces the concept of the guiding star, which in Adlerian psychology is the practice of contribution to others. As long as your thoughts and actions are aligned with the goal of being useful to the community, you can never truly go wrong or become lost, no matter how many people dislike you or how chaotic the world around you becomes. The youth finally internalizes the deep truth of these teachings, recognizing that his long night of debate has not been an intellectual game, but a profound confrontation with his own lifestyle choices. He realizes that the power to change his world does not depend on shifting his external environment, altering his past, or waiting for society to evolve. The world is not an objective reality that dictates his happiness. It is a subjective experience constructed entirely through his own mental lenses. The dialogue concludes as the youth steps out of the philosopher's study and into the crisp, quiet night air. He looks up at the vast sky, no longer burdened by the chains of seeking recognition or the fear of failure, completely filled with a deep sense of self-acceptance, unconditional trust, and the quiet, revolutionary courage to be disliked. Chapter 57 is titled Give Meaning to Seemingly Meaningless Life, and it serves as the ultimate philosophical anchor for the entire five-night dialogue. The philosopher addresses the youth's final lingering anxiety about how to navigate a world that often feels chaotic, unfair, or completely devoid of purpose. He reiterates with absolute clarity that life has no inherent, objective meaning laid out by fate or the cosmos. However, rather than leading to despair, this realization is presented as the ultimate form of human freedom. Because there is no pre-written blueprint, you are the sole author of your existence. The meaning of your life is not something you look for and discover, but something you actively create and assign to each present moment through your own choices and actions. The dialogue introduces the crucial Adlerian concept of the guiding star to ensure that this absolute freedom does not lead to isolation or confusion. The philosopher explains that no matter what hardships you face, and no matter how many people dislike you, you will never lose your way as long as your guiding star is contribution to others. When you live with the internal goal of being useful to the human community on a horizontal plane, your actions naturally align with a sense of purpose. This shift from asking what the world can give you to what you can give the world is the final piece of the puzzle. The youth realizes that by taking responsibility for creating his own meaning, he no longer needs to wait for his external circumstances to change. He has the power to define the value of his existence right now. The afterword brings a deeply personal and reflective conclusion to the entire journey, transitioning from the intense intellectual debate to a quiet moment of profound transformation. The narrative describes the final moments as the youth stands in the philosopher's study, realizing that the long night of argument was not just an academic exercise, but a life-altering confrontation with his own lifestyle. He sees that his deep unhappiness was a self-imposed prison built from the fear of being ordinary, the desire for recognition, and the habit of living in yesterday and tomorrow. By accepting the concepts of self-acceptance, unconditional trust, and the separation of tasks, the youth finally finds the strength to break his chains and step onto a flat plane of equality with the rest of the world. As the youth thanks the philosopher and steps out of the house, he is met with the crisp, quiet air of the early morning. The world around him has not changed, yet everything is entirely different because his internal lens has shifted. He looks at the vast sky and the path ahead with a deep, unprecedented sense of peace and self-reliance. He understands that the world is a simple place and that the courage to be happy resides entirely within his own hands. The book concludes on this powerful note of individual agency, leaving the youth and the reader standing on the threshold of a new life, fully equipped with the revolutionary courage to be disliked and the freedom to dance intensely in the eternal now.